Humankind, though capable of wonderful things like cooperation or art, is a selfish and oftentimes foolish race. Some of us are corruptible and weak, willing to turn on others for personal gain. At some point in our lives, we long for something that either seems impossible or simply is, especially those of us that have experienced tragedy or an intense personal loss. This pain can often be unbearable, permeating our minds in a haze so thick that it affects our ability to see clearly. This inherent fallibility can be our greatest strength, granting us the sting of regret, remorse, or grief, feelings that, when acknowledged, teach us powerful and important messages about ourselves and the world around us. However, in the wrong context, it can also be our greatest weakness, causing us to lash out in anger and make decisions we know to be the wrong ones. This fragility is exploitable. It's easy to manipulate. The fact that the dark forces in our lives often use against us, be it the nagging desire of an addiction, the need to hide from one's past, or in the case of doom, the very voices of hell itself. In the ancient past, one particular universe housed the Order of the Night Sentinels, a group of warriors within the spacefaring race known as the Argenta. This species is likely where humanity originated from, and thanks to their long-storied existence and the aid of superior technologies from a godlike race called the Makers, they were able to develop a vast and impressive civilization among the stars. It's unclear exactly how many planets fell under their rule, but given the impressive scope of their abilities, they were able to colonize many worlds throughout the Milky Way galaxy, or perhaps even beyond that. Their civilization prospered for many generations, but all great empires, whether they are cruel or just, eventually face conflict. But no conflict was ever at the magnitude of the war that began at the arrival of a mysterious stranger from an alternate dimension. This odd man's appearance heralded the beginning of the greatest loss of life their people had ever seen. When the foreigner entered their world, he brought with it the awareness of dimensions beyond their own, the worst of which being a plane of existence called Jakad, a place the Argenta would come to know as Hell. Upon the appearance of this great evil, the Night Sentinels led a charge against this new enemy, taking up arms and doing what they do best: fighting. At the front of their offensive lines, the Outlander from a different realm fought with unparalleled ferocity. His hatred for these creatures was a powerful tool, a tool that the leaders of the Night Sentinels intended to use against their newly acquired opposition. His fighting style was brutal and barbaric, so a great commander within their order, a man by the name of Valen, was given the task of teaching the outsider the ways of their culture. The two fought together through many battles, often leading the charge against the demons. When the stranger arrived, he had nothing. One man with nothing to lose fights better than any other. The fear of death becomes irrelevant. Oftentimes, it's desired. Unfortunately, Valen was not in the same position. He did have something to lose. His son battled in the Night Sentinels' armies as well, and during one bloody brawl, he was killed by the creatures of hell. The death of his only son haunted Valen, regularly giving him horrific visions of his child's eternal suffering at the hands of the demons. Unbeknownst to him, these torturous nightmares were injected into his mind by the enemies they faced. One of the Night Sentinels' religious leaders, a man by the name of Grav, was helping facilitate these malignant mirages, attempting to further drive Valen's mind off the edge. The three leaders of a spiritual group called Daig had secretly aligned themselves with Hell, effectively betraying their people and eventually becoming what would be known as Hell Priests. Turning them against their people was seemingly easy, and using these newly acquired pawns, demonic forces were able to spread their corruption even further. Once Valen had been significantly worn down by these horrific visions, Daig Grav eventually made him an insidious offer. In exchange for access to an ancient source of sentinel power called the Elemental Sepulchre, he would help end his offspring's suffering by resurrecting his son. By all accounts, Valen was a good and honorable man, but in a moment of weakness and desperation, he agreed. This strange energy source originated from a mysterious and powerful race called the Elemental Wraiths, beings that the Argenta worshipped as gods prior to their alliance with the Makers. With access to these beings, the forces of Hell absorbed them into their dimension, torturing them and siphoning the unique energy they output. This newfound power allowed the forces of Hell to literally absorb portions of the homeworld of the Argenta, Argent-Dinner. This ultimate betrayal, first by the Daig priests and then Valen, gave Hell immeasurable power, and their expansion was greatly accelerated as a result. Not only were many of Valen's compatriots killed because of this deal, but the so-called resurrection of his son was greatly exaggerated. Instead of bringing him back, his heart and soul were used to resuscitate a long-dormant hellish behemoth, a titan that was defeated by the Outlander long ago, a being known as the Icon of Sin. Valen's pain and misery was turned against him, and even after successfully maintaining his part of the twisted bargain, his reward was more suffering. This decision wrought his heart with immeasurable guilt, and in an attempt to make penance, he chose to remain in hell for the rest of his existence. Sometimes the presence of suffering isn't even necessary to influence others. When it comes to more weak-minded individuals, the promises of power are oftentimes more than enough to instigate betrayal. The most prominent example of this was Dr. Malcolm Betruger. Originally a man of fact, Betruger was in charge of a scientific and archaeological study on the surface of the red planet, Mars. Tons of artifacts had been excavated from within the sands of the distant world, objects from a previously undiscovered and highly advanced civilization. Upon studying these strange items, they discovered the mathematical blueprints to the secret of teleportation. With this newfound knowledge, they got to work constructing portals based on the information they'd gleaned. It was eventually successful, but they quickly realized that the portals they were creating didn't simply transfer objects from A to B. Instead, it briefly sent them to an alternate space, a new dimension. The mysterious nature of the odd place led Betruger to become absolutely obsessed with the teleportation technology, and more specifically, whatever existed on the other side of the gateways. The eventual collection of actual living specimens from the newly discovered place, Hell, only ignited the fires of his fascination, and he quickly decided he needed to know everything about this bizarre space. This interest quickly escalated to infatuation as the denizens of the dark dimension whispered promises of power into the lead scientist's head. As it turns out, Betruger was very easily corruptible, and the forces of hell quickly managed to drive him to insanity. With his mind now fractured, he worked even harder than before to open more portals to the dark dimension in an attempt to allow the demons into his plane of existence. Earth and its inhabitants would become a bargaining chip, and in exchange for his continued support, he'd be granted unbelievable power. His goal was to help trigger a full-scale invasion. Betruger set his plan in motion, but thankfully it was thwarted by a few brave and particularly tenacious Marines. Despite the fact that the evil had been sabotaged, Hell kept their promise, and he was turned into the demonic entity known as Maledict. In this new, dragon-like form, he was given what he desired, immense power, but of course, it came at a price. Since most of the gateways to Hell had been closed, he was trapped within the fiery dimension, and his human form had been transfigured into a gruesome, winged beast. As a reward for his efforts, he had been given his own small dominion within the Molten Shores, an area simply named Castle Betruger. Despite his newfound abilities, he was eventually defeated by a lone Marine, and his hellish parcel would eventually fall into obscurity. Its history, much like the history of other worlds previously consumed by Hell, would be forgotten to time. The name Betruger no longer held any meaning, and the power he had craved in life was ripped away from him in death. Much like Malcolm Betruger, Olivia Pierce was also a scientist working within the UAC on their Mars installations. Her position was far more impressive than Malcolm's, though, as she'd been handpicked to be the protege of one of the greatest minds to ever spawn from humankind. Well, seemingly. A chairman of the UAC, a man named Samuel Hayden, was an absolute genius whose intelligence truly knew no bounds. When he was diagnosed with a deadly and aggressive form of brain cancer, he quickly set out to cheat death. Through what appeared to be sheer brilliance, he transferred his mind into a large robotic chassis. The exact mechanics of how he managed to do this were initially shrouded in mystery, but regardless, the outlandish plan was successful. He wasn't able to save his body, but his mind could continue to live on, and as such, he could further his work within the UAC. In this new body, he continued to make impressive technological advances, eventually recruiting a student of his to oversee a project dubbed Lazarus. This woman was Olivia Pierce. Not long after her arrival, she was diagnosed with a medical condition, acute idiopathic scoliosis. This particular type of scoliosis causes the spine to develop an abnormal curve and has no definitive cause. Once this condition was brought to light, she was given two options: become wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life or attempt an experimental augmentation procedure, the results of which, if performed correctly, would help maintain her ability to walk. But in order for the procedure to work properly, a full-body metallic exoskeleton would be fused to her spinal cord. She agreed to attempt the surgery, and it was successful, but it didn't come without side effects. She was able to move, but doing so brought her extreme pain. Medications to dull the aches she felt were prescribed to her, but she refused to take them for fear that they would cloud her mind, an asset she believed to be her greatest. This constant and intense pain made her weak and miserable, both facts that demonkind planned to exploit. In her mind, Hell's invasion was likely inevitable, so instead of running from it or fighting it, she opted to aid them instead. According to the Dark Ones, those who helped in the Earth's consumption would be spared the upcoming torment. As they say, if you can't beat them, join them. She and Betruger were quite similar after all. The main differences being she didn't seem to desire power, and she wasn't completely insane. Instead, she foolishly believed the beast's words. She took their promises to heart. What exactly the demons had guaranteed her, aside from being spared immense suffering, is unclear. But more than likely, they offered her a cure to her condition. Naturally, this so-called remedy wasn't exactly what she had imagined. When she finally entered Hell, she was brutalized by its inhabitants, and soon after, she would merge with an exceedingly rare species of demon, the Arania Imperatrix, which roughly means spider mastermind. By becoming one with the demonic behemoth, her problem was eliminated. She no longer felt the pain from her scoliosis or her exoskeleton, but as usual, it came at a price. She was now part of a hideous demon that would be killed by the Doomslayer shortly after she had merged with it. I suppose, in a way, she was pardoned from the suffering that Hell would bring, but she wasn't released from it by demon kind. Instead, she was spared by the mighty Slayer, killed in an act of mercy. The Makers are a godlike race that oversaw much of existence and were worshipped as divine entities by many of its inhabitants. Chief among them is a being referred to as a Khan, a powerful creature that is birthed every 10,000 years by the Singularity, an almost hive mind of the collective Maker intelligence. Their lifespan is exceedingly long, but eventually they will age and deteriorate, a process known as transfiguration. This degradation appears to be extremely painful, causing their minds to splinter and their bodies to transform into hideous eldritch abominations. When the time comes, they undergo a mysterious ritual in which they die voluntarily and are somehow resurrected. This strange procedure requires the presence of their supreme leader, an ancient and alien entity known as the Father. The most recent Khan Maker was born like all of the others before her, but during her rule, the Father disappeared, which meant a new Khan couldn't be created. Without the presence of the Father, her rule was uncontested, and when her life started to approach its conclusion, the transfiguration process soon to be inevitable, a discovery was made. Through the extraction of Wraith energy mixed with Hell energy, a fuel source created via the torture of a human soul, a new form of power could be created. This new fuel source came to be known as Argent energy, and with it, she was able to stave off the transfiguration process. In order to keep herself and the rest of the Maker race alive, she'd need a stable supply of Argent energy. In normal circumstances, this fuel source was limitless, but her world was so unbelievably advanced that she needed copious amounts. So much like Valen, Malcolm, and Olivia, the Khan made a deal with the devil. In exchange for a steady supply of Argent energy, she would aid in the consumption of Earth. If it meant saving her world, no sacrifice was too great. At this point, I don't think I need to tell you that this deal came with undesirable side effects. She got the energy she wanted, but by aiding Hell, she simply turned the anger of the Doomslayer against her. Unbeknownst to her, she was being manipulated by the ruler of the Umbral Plane, the ancient entity Devoth. By helping the demons, the mighty Slayer's rage would be redirected towards her, and even she would be powerless to stop it. This was Devoth's plan all along. He wanted revenge on the Makers, for they had imprisoned him within Hell long ago. By manipulating them to not only imbue the Slayer with a piece of his essence, as well as giving the Khan a reason to consort with demonkind, the Slayer's rage would inevitably strike her down. She would be killed, and Devoth's thirst for vengeance would be quenched. In the end, this is what makes the Doomslayer such an important and even inspiring figure. In the face of Hell itself, with an endless army of horrific monstrosities, his will is absolute. When everyone around him, even the gods themselves, are manipulated and broken, he is unbreakable, incorruptible, unyielding. He chose the path of perpetual torment. He chose to continue his fight even when everything he knew and loved was lost. His friends, his family, his world, his people, all gone, but he wouldn't slow, he wouldn't hesitate. All who wronged him would perish, and he would make damn sure what happened to him never happened to anyone else again. He would rip and tear until it was done. Alright, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you might as well subscribe, right? Okay, thanks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Doom.